Hi there. My name is Alexandr Lvov. I'm a PhD in philosophy and associate professor at the Department of History of Philosophy at St. Petersburg University, and I would like to share some ideas of mine on Leo Tolstoy as a Socratic thinker with you. With Leo Tolstoy, a Russian person is both very lucky and very unlucky. The fact is that Tolstoy, being a great writer, thinker, true philosopher, and a true spiritual genius, always turns out to be inconvenient for any researcher. The depth of his artistic genius is staggering, and half of the world, mostly Western, knows him primarily as a consummate artist of the word. The other half of the world, mostly Eastern, honors him rather as a great moralist and founder of the ethics of non-violence, the ideological precursor of Mahatma Gandhi's doctrine of satyagraha, and a spiritual teacher. For us, the people of Russian culture, to speak of Tolstoy in such terms would be the same as discussing how beautiful and free the butterfly is while looking at its corpse pinned up and carefully covered by the coffin of the window. For us, Tolstoy is at the same time an artist, a free thinker, an adopter of Pushkin's tradition, and a man who consciously rejected the millennia-old experience of the Christian doctrine of the Orthodox Church. It is always fascinatingly risky to discuss Tolstoy, because to look into this abyss means to abandon all possible templates and samples, to follow his leading and therefore unstoppable like the flow of the mountain river and uncompromising thought. In my lecture, I study the parallels between Socrates and Leo Tolstoy as independent thinkers. These parallels could be traced in several aspects. First of all, in their methods. I discuss Tolstoy's method of estrangement, so-called остранение, given in his fiction and non-fiction as an interpretation and development of Socrates' irony. Secondly, I compare Socrates and Tolstoy as moral thinkers. The ultimate purpose of their research is to point out and distinguish what people consider to be true by default and what is true indeed. Thirdly, I turn to their activities as preachers and focus on the classical problems whether both of them blasphemed the traditional religious views and, consequently, corrupt their followers. To clarify this point, I study and compare Socrates' understanding of to daimonion and Tolstoy's search for faith, which he metaphorically expressed in a fable of a green wand. Finally, I interpret the views of Socrates and Tolstoy on death as a liberation of a person for a better life. I argue that one of the most astonishing interpretations of Plato's allegory of the cave is Tolstoy's final chapter of Resurrection, which brings light to the classical problem of sudden release of a person in the cave. Thus, I conclude that Leo Tolstoy's path, the same way as Socrates' one, was not about answers but questioning and scrutiny of the life we do not usually dare to live by our own. This is what brings them both to the line of great thinkers and spiritual authority figures. First of all, I have to emphasize that I'm going to speak about a Socratic path of Leo Tolstoy, not to compare Socrates and Tolstoy's doctrines. It means I would like to point out the typical Socratic aspects in Tolstoy as an independent moral thinker and preacher. Many say that Socrates was a philosopher par excellence, as it is, and give them such names as pagan Christ or an ideal philosopher. In this perspective, to speak about the Socratic path means more than to speak about Socrates himself, whether we consider him as a historical or fictional character. Thus, my goal goes beyond the concrete figures as I'm going to scrutinize the principal positions that make this or that philosopher Socratic. Let me now clarify the meaning of the concept Socratic. Let us turn to Socrates as a cultural figure, avoiding to raise a notorious Socratic problem. What do we know about Socrates? We actually know only the following. Firstly, that he was born in 417 BC he was a son to a sculptor and a midwife and lived all his life in Athens. Secondly, that he was a third-class Athenian citizen, one of Zeugite, fulfilled his military service and participated in 3 campaigns as a hoplite during the Peloponnesian War. Thirdly, that he was married to Xanthippe and had 2 or 3 children. Fourthly, that he took part in political activity and manifested himself as an independent individual in making decisions in trial of generals of the Battle of Arginusa and during the 30 Tyrants. Fifthly and finally, that he died in 399 BC after a trial for impiety and the corruption of the young by drinking poison. From this historical or objective perspective, we could say that Socrates was a typical Athenian and his life path was not outstanding. When one compares Socrates to Alcibiades, Critias, Xenophon, or even Plato, one finds Socratic way of life pretty normal. What makes Socrates special is his individual self-understanding of himself and the world around him as his own problem. The world is not something given and constant. It has, to put it metaphorically, its own face and personality. It has its own character. And Socrates tried to understand the world being its inalienable element. This is probably the most important and brief characteristic of what we could call Socratic as a concept. An intensive religious inner life that leads to scrutiny of the traditional or normal way of life in the society a person lives. From this philosophical perspective, and I emphasize the philosophical character of my study, we would call Socratic figures Buddha, Christ, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Leo Tolstoy among the others, and their paths definitely Socratic ones. After all, we have such concepts as Socratic method or Socratic irony, Socratic dialogue. Why are they Socratic? Consequently, I argue that such an inner stance to the world demands a certain method of how one scrutinizes the social behavior, beliefs, and views. To do this, one should take quite a philosophical distance, a position comparable to the one the anthropologists keep to distinguish the patterns of behavior. For Socrates, that was irony, and Leo Tolstoy is famous for his literary method of estrangement or остранение, as a Soviet critic Viktor Shklovsky put that. Such a distance supposes that a person has deliberately taken it and keeps as a certain viewpoint. What makes a person hold strong in taking such a position? All those Socratic figures realized that there is somebody or something inside them as a feeling that they belong to God, to some spiritual reality. They understood that they feel and anticipate the kingdom which is not of this world, which gives us 2 important perspectives. An inner one, which is connected with self-realization of a certain inner voice that makes a person strange to the others. A well-known Socratic daimonion, taken in a very broad sense, can be a good example to this point. For Tolstoy, that was his feeling of death, which brought him to his unorthodox creed. And the outer one, which concerns the desire of the person to foresee and establish a conclusive image of this kingdom. The outer perspective brings the person to a dialogue with his contemporaries in order to find out whether they really say what they mean and mean what they say. This makes the person an outlaw, an outsider, and marginalizes the person as an insane one. However, such a person is the one who is really sane, and their foolishness is actually an attitude to the non-philosophical, thus non-reasonable common sense, which people have just adopted and never investigated into its nature and potentials. Let us now turn to Tolstoy's method. I've already mentioned that it is a method of estrangement, остранение, given in his fiction and non-fiction. I would like to introduce its interpretation in the course of the development of Socrates' irony. Socrates developed irony as a mighty instrument to scrutinize the common views within his maieutic method, or as he called it, elenchus. Tolstoy uses the method of estrangement to demonstrate that the world we live in is not simply a self-evident world. The same way as Socrates practiced his elenchus, refuting the common sense of his compatriots, Tolstoy examines the common situations, practices, and even as an alien, a being that has just arrived from an outer space and has no idea about either the way people live or the culture they belong to. He describes his characters like that. I would here recall Natasha Rostova's first ball, or Andrei Bolkonsky's impression of Napoleon, whom he saw on the battlefield of Austerlitz. He discusses the death penalty like that. Take, for instance, his publication «Не могу молчать», I cannot keep calm anymore, which he describes a case of death penalty from the point of view of a person who does not really understand what goes on and why it happens. Finally, he practices his method in his research of gospel. Tolstoy's idea is very simple and ambitious at the same time. If Christ told to people and his disciples what he really told, his words should be understood accurately as they were said, without any interpretation, commentaries, or translations. Of course, he produced his own translations of gospel, which is a kind of commentary, but I draw your attention to the very fact that this attempt and approach. As a Socratic thinker, he didn't intend to establish a hieresis, a philosophical school, or to introduce and defend a certain religious worldview, as Apostle Paul, for instance, did. The ambition of the Socratic thinkers is in the toil of understanding, in explaining their inner view, which belongs not to them, but to someone or something they anticipate as a reality, or the domain of truth. It is actually perfectly expressed in Matthew chapter 18, when Jesus said, and I quote, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." End of quote. Not in terms of establishing a sect, but the alive labor of understanding, discussion, and dialogue. The same way the ideal polis exists not on earth, but in the logoi of those who participate in the dialogue with Socrates. Plato's Republic is rather an ontological and epistemological than a political treatise. To add to estrangement as a method, I would say that Leo Tolstoy brings his reader in this position to change the optics of the common sense. He was infected, so to say, with his fear of death, which changed his perspective completely. We do not usually think about death. We prefer not to remember that irrevocable time passes, the same way we think that the state, the laws, the values, the principles of our communication and social behavior are simply given, and we are a sort of hostages of the tradition. However, we are those who introduce principles and laws. We are those who establish practices. We are those who formulate the values, and to take it ironic or an estranged position towards the world we live in means not to start speaking from ourselves, but to give a word to another speaker whom a person feels inside or behind him or her. I would say, anticipating my analysis of Plato's metaphor of the cave, that those people inside the cave are really those who are independent, self-confident, and free in their choices and views. But in reality, they are captured and bound and cannot make a single move, while the one who gets free is the one who paradoxically takes a passive position. Now I'm coming to the comparison of Socrates and Tolstoy as moral thinkers. Obviously, the ultimate purpose of their research is to point out and distinguish that people consider to be true by default, and what is true indeed. For Socratic thinkers, moral problems come to the foreground because of their applied character. The statement that we cannot influence what is on heavens or on earth by studying the laws of nature, but we can influence ourselves by studying human nature, attributed to Socrates, is well known. Tolstoy eloquently repeats this statement in his Confessions. He reports about his approach to sciences like mathematics and physics and his failure to find out the consolation to his fear of death. I have to remind you that Tolstoy was actually a very reasonable person in terms of common sense, and his starting point could really be called a positivistic one. However, only those people of common sense are able to reject such a position as soon as they feel its restrictions and limitations. Being reasonable, they try to find out if the others see the foundations of the world and society we live in, and they make spiritual revolution because of their wish to keep the world they live in safe. This is an important idea that was formulated by an outstanding German physicist of the 20th century, Werner Heisenberg. Revolutions happen when we try to change a tiny thing or improve something meaningless in accordance with the paradigm, not when we desire to reconstruct the whole building of the universe. Those who are willing to find out if the world has foundations act the same way. They accept the paradigm and investigate very particular things, not thinking about any serious changes. But this becomes an unbearable task to the others because the order of things has usually been accepted by default, and people never think about foundations because they know only the epiphenomena of the world. This is how a crowd behaves. But to consider the foundations makes a person to acquire a certain face, to become recognizable. As Socrates said, "Speak for me to recognize you." And the French novelist Romain Rolland was very insightful when he said that the contemporary humankind has a face of Tolstoy. Now I turn to Socrates and Tolstoy's activities as preachers, and focus on the classical problem whether both of them blasphemed the traditional religious views and, consequently, corrupt the followers. To clarify this point, I study and compare Socrates' understanding of Todaimonion and Tolstoy's search for faith, which he metaphorically expressed in a fable of a green wand. Tolstoy thought that the Orthodox Church is just an institution that was arranged by the people themselves, and there is nothing in its doctrine that cannot be human. It means that the real words of Christ, whom he didn't consider to be a god, but a wise teacher of faith and morality, should be understood without any means that separate us as his followers from his words. But how can we find out that really understand Christ properly? Tolstoy's answer is very Socratic, through understanding and examination of our own understanding, that is, by the means of a creative and constructive dialogue. Socrates, as we are told by the later testimonies, was willing to find out why the god of Delphi named him the wisest Athenian, and he felt that his real duty was to prove or disprove this definition with a little help of his friends and compatriots. Socrates also had what we call after him Todaimonion, an inner voice that didn't allow him to do wrong things. This is the evidence of what the Christians say about as an inner man or inner Christ, a voice of the personal deity inside. Tolstoy tells us an eloquent fable about his invocation to study human nature. His brother Nikolai told him a legend about a green wand on which the recipe of the bliss life was inscribed, and he hid it in the ravine of the estate of Yasnaya Polyana. Tolstoy says that when he was a child, he really believed that this green wand existed and did his best to find it. When he became an old man, he says, he still believed that such a wand existed, because if you do not believe, or at least admit that it exists, you will not try to search for it and find it, and unless you do so, there is no purpose in our life at all. Thus, we see that Tolstoy's attitude to orthodoxy is not really the one of a blasphemer. He didn't want to demolish the Holy Scripture and demonstrate scientifically that there is no God at all. His task was to examine if this way to find the green wand was fruitful, and if not, to understand why and introduce his own arguments on the case. As a Socratic thinker, he saw something beyond any institutions or usual human authorities. He spoke of a kingdom of truth that should be reached whatever religion people support or moral framework they share. Now I come to the crucial point in my meditation, an interpretation of the views of Socrates and Tolstoy on death as a liberation of a person for a better life. I argue that one of the most astonishing interpretations of Plato's allegory of the cave is Tolstoy's final chapter of his last novel, Resurrection, which brings light to the classical problem of sudden release of a person in the cave, namely a resurrection that happened to Prince Dmitry Nekhlyudov. Plato's famous book 7 in his Republic starts with an extremely influential myth of the cave. It tells us about those who are strictly chained and tied inside the cave and cannot see the real things but only their shades, and no light but the light of the fire inside the cave behind them. The whole metaphor concerns our sleepy condition until the voice of the truth, represented by Todaimonion, a certain personal deity comparable to the guardian angel in Christianity, makes us wake up and follow it out from the cave to the real world and the light of the sun. But does one become at least free from the chains and ties and able to find the way out? Plato says, among the following, and I quote, "Consider then what would be the manner of the release and healing from these bonds and this folly, if in the course of nature something of this sort should happen to them. When one was freed from his fetters and compelled to stand up suddenly and turn his head around and walk and to lift up his eyes to the light, and in doing all this felt pain, and because of the dazzle and glitter of the light was unable to discern the objects whose shadows he formerly saw." I have only to notice that in the Greek original we see the verb anistaschai, which is the passive form of anistemi, to stand up, rise up, which also gives us anastasis, that is, resurrection. Thus, something that occasionally happened to the man inside this cave, who had no other experience before but the false experience of the shadows on the wall, somehow changes all his life completely. Plato emphasizes further that the man could never return back unlearned, free from his experience of being awake. If so, the others who are still sitting inside the cave will never understand him and will even think that he is mocking them and will eagerly wish to bring him to death. Obviously, the man Plato is talking about is Socrates. But the very idea that this wake is possible and changes the whole human life after it happened raises an ultimate question. How does the man become free, and how does he understand that he is free himself? It is interesting to notice that Martin Heidegger, an inspired commentator of the Greek thinkers, paid no attention to this sudden change. In his lecture course on the essence of truth, he thoroughly studied the doctrine of paideia, but in his rendering of the myth, he just mentions that sudden transformation of the man's position, giving no comments on its nature. Mark Rothel rightly notices that Heidegger is a notoriously violent reader of other philosophers. He reads them to discover the unsaid in their thought. The unsaid is the background assumptions, dispositions, conceptual system, etc., which ground the actual views they accept. Let me make now a conceptual detour and briefly turn to Aristotle's explanation of time. In his Physics, Aristotle gives an important formulation of how one notices that something has changed in the current of time. He proves that time is neither motion itself nor exists without motion, and illustrates his point with a legend. But neither does time exist without change. For when the state of our own minds does not change at all, or we have not noticed its changing, we do not realize that time has elapsed, any more than those who are fabled to sleep among the heroes in Sardinia do when they are awakened. For they connect the earlier now with the later and make them one, cutting out the interval because of their failure to notice it. So, we see that time does not exist without any motion, and yet it is not motion itself. The very idea of time, in this aspect, could be understood in terms of this kind of links between different nows. How does one know that the time passes? Only being in the current of time and linking its moments, joining them together and staying awake. For if one is sleeping, he or she will never join the present and the past, even because he or she is out of the current of time. According to Plato, something or someone makes the man get out from the cave, and the whole metaphor is the story of the man's awakening given in passive voice. But when the man becomes able to watch the sun and understands that everything that was happening in the cave is only shadows and false, he remembers his previous accommodation with sorrow and grief. After he achieves this knowledge, the further story is given in active voice. Aristotle speaks about the same when he thinks about the very meaning of temporality. The non-realization of the existence of time happens to us when we do not distinguish any change, but the soul seems to stay in one indivisible state, and when we perceive and distinguish, we say time has elapsed. A Russian philosopher, Vladimir Bibikhin, in his lecture course, A Period, Time Being, tries to reconstruct classical concept of the now in Aristotelian tradition, as well as to trace back to the roots of the high Greek classic thought of the very problem of time. He also proposes a profound idea of the correlations between the historical detours and critical points and the concept of the now. The latter appears to be a certain point that measures any historical developments or reconstructions. He asks, what is the nun as a moment of time, and gives the following answer. The same way the present appears from somewhere in the torrent of things, making recognize itself, see it as a frontier. It suggests somehow itself to join and divide simultaneously due to this paradoxical feature. Bibikhin thinks about Plato's concept of excifness as something that distinguishes the subject of temporality. As the prisoner in the cave becomes free only when he realizes the true nature and appearance of things, the subject becomes present, that is, obtains a temporal measure and existence in time and history, only when he realizes its restrictions or frontiers as such. The philosopher emphasizes its oneness and self-regulation that demands one's attention as a possibility of finding the roots. Bibikhin says, and I quote, Horace's carpe diem means the light, insight, and verges on excifness, Plato's suddenly, in which, for instance, a gold miner finds a bar of gold, while he dug, obviously gradually, not suddenly. Time and period as an opened way are sudden. By this suddenness obviously demands the digging up. It concerns us who started this theme as well. In these terms, the problems of excifness, or suddenly, as a frontier, appears to be the problem of being and concerns Heidegger's famous investigation of being and time. Leo Tolstoy was a great Russian thinker as well as writer, for the Russian thought historically is a fact of literature. He gives us an illustrious example of this kind of wake in his novel Resurrection. Shortly, the plot is the following. The main character, Prince Dmitry Nekhludov, resurrects from the dead souls of his higher society, owing to his love to Katyusha Maslova, a fallen prostitute whom he, being a gilded youth, seduced. He saw her in the court while the trial, in which he participated as a juror, and recognized her as the subject of his passion. After she were sentenced to penal servitude in Siberia, he felt himself guilty in her moral lapse and tried to help her and rescue her from the prison. Although he failed, he was sure that he had to share the penalty with her and follow her to Siberia among the other prisoners. Katyusha made him understand that she did not need any sacrification from him, and then in Siberia he met an English tourist who visited the jails and talked to the prisoners. He gave Nekhludov a copy of Gospel, which he later read. "And is this all?" Nekhludov suddenly exclaimed around, and in the inner voice of the whole of his being said, "Yes, it is all." And it happened to Nekhludov as it often happens to men who are living a spiritual life. The thought that seemed strange at first and paradoxical, or even to be only a joke, being confirmed more and more often by life's experience, suddenly appeared as the simplest, truest certainty. The whole book contains approximately 500 pages in Russian, and the whole story before this Nekhludov's claim takes 496 pages. The quotation is from the last chapter called "A New Life Dawns for Nekhludov," and the final sentences demonstrate that the whole idea, the main purpose of the novel for Leo Tolstoy, was to bring us through these 400 and something pages to the resurrection. And a perfectly new life dawned that night for Nekhludov, not because he had entered into new conditions of life, but because everything he did after that night had a new and quite different significance than before. How this new period of his life will end, time alone will prove. The main character has been changed, and he is not interesting for us anymore because he stopped being the character of this novel. He has transformed completely. We would like to emphasize this sudden claim for the prince and the inner voice, comparing with Socrates' daimonion, that support and maintain the fact of resurrection. Victor Shklovsky compared the final of Resurrection with the final of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. He considered them both to demonstrate the impossibility of any positive solution from the situations described in the novels. Although I'm not a literary scholar, in my opinion, such a comparison is far-fetched because Tolstoy's novel gives a profound comment upon the Plato's idea of the suddenly untied prisoner who is eager to bring knowledge of truth to the others, and that is why he stops being prisoner anymore. The frontier of this sudden insight suddenly is a paramount of the Russian thought best presented by the great Russian novelist. To conclude, I would say that Leo Tolstoy's path very much resembles the one of Socrates. It was not about answers, but about questioning and scrutiny of the life we do not usually dare to live by our own. That is why every Socratic thinker lives not for this reality, but for a better one. Their real task is to establish the perennial truth about the world as such, and consequently to encourage people to get closer to the origin of their sense of life.